The day started quiet the way most dangerous days do. Sergeant Owen Hart walked the dirt path at the base of Drakenmore Cliffs just after midday, boots crunching over dry stone, eyes moving slow and steady across the tree line. It was his third patrol that week and nothing had happened on any of them. That was fine by Owen. He preferred quiet. He had learned a long time ago that quiet meant everyone was still alive. The cliffs rose high on his left, dark gray rock, ancient and cracked, full of ledges and hollows that went back deep into the mountain. The Veilthorn had lived in those cliffs for longer than the human colony had existed. Longer than most things on this world if the old records were right. Owen had never been up there. No human had. The Veilthorn did not invite and the humans had learned not to ask. He knew about the hatchlings though. Everyone at the colony did. 7 eggs had hatched that season in the upper caverns. A good number, the Veilthorn considered it a sign of strong years ahead. The mother, a younger dragon the colonists called Lyra among themselves, had been seen on the cliff ledges most mornings, watching the valley below with careful golden eyes. She was not friendly toward humans. She was not cruel either. She simply watched, the way her kind always did, deciding things slowly and from a distance. The adult Veilthorn had left 2 days ago on their migration flight. It happened every year at this time, a sacred thing tied to the memory of their dead. They flew east toward the mountains beyond the horizon and were gone for 3 days. Owen did not fully understand it. He respected it anyway. Lyra had stayed behind. Someone always stayed with the hatchlings. Owen was thinking about none of this when he smelled the smoke. It hit him light at first, the way smoke does when it is still far off, just a thin thread in the air, easy to miss. He stopped walking, lifted his head, turned slowly until the smell got stronger. Then he looked south along the cliff base and saw it. A column of gray smoke was rising from the brush about 400 meters ahead, already wide at the base, climbing fast into the pale sky. Even from this distance he could see the orange flicker at the bottom where the fire was eating through the dry summer grass. Owen broke into a run. He had heard the supply drone go down earlier that morning, a low distant crash, the kind that shook the ground just slightly. The colony had logged it and sent a recovery note. Nobody had gotten there yet. The fuel cells on those drones burned hot and they burned long. Dry brush in late summer was all the invitation a fuel fire needed. By the time he reached the edge of the fire line it was already wider than he had expected. The wind was pushing it northeast, up along the base of the cliff, toward the narrow path that climbed the rock face. The brush crackled and popped and the heat hit him like an open oven door. He grabbed his radio. Hart to base, I have a wildfire at the south cliff base, approximately 400 meters from marker 7, moving northeast fast. I need fire response and I need it now. The reply came back calm and immediate. Backup and the fire unit were being scrambled. 40 minutes out, minimum. The nearest team was on the far side of the colony dealing with a water system failure. 40 minutes. Owen stood at the fire line and did the calculation without wanting to. The fire was already moving up the cliff path. The path led to the ledges. The ledges led to the upper caverns. The hatchlings were in the upper caverns. He looked up the cliff face. The smoke was already rising along the rock, funneled upward by the shape of the stone. He could see the dark mouth of the cavern entrance from here, a wide shadow up on the third ledge maybe 60 meters above. High enough to feel impossible. Close enough to matter. Then he heard it. Then, cutting right through the roar of the fire below. The sound of small creatures in pure panic, not the deep rumbling sound of adult Veilthorn, but something smaller and higher and desperate. The hatchlings had smelled the smoke. They were frightened. They were calling for their mother. Owen stood very still for one moment. He looked at his radio. He looked at the fire spreading across the brush to his right. He looked up at the cavern entrance and the smoke curling past it. He looked back down the path he had come from, toward the colony lights that were still just barely visible on the horizon. Backup was 40 minutes away. The fire would reach the upper ledges in 10. Maybe less. He set his radio down carefully on a flat rock at the base of the cliff. He pulled off his outer jacket and tore a long strip from the bottom. He uncapped his water canteen and soaked the strip through, then tied it across his nose and mouth. He tightened the laces on his boots. He rolled his sleeves down and fastened them at the wrist. Then he put his hands on the rock and started climbing. The cliff face was rough and old, good for gripping but punishing on bare hands. He moved fast, not careful, finding holds by feel more than sight, pulling himself upward with the kind of focus that leaves no room for thinking about anything except the next handhold and the next ledge. The smoke was already thickening around him by the time he reached the second ledge, catching in his throat even through the wet cloth, making his eyes water and sting. He kept going. Below him the fire was spreading wider now. He could hear it growing louder, a constant low roar that filled the air the way water fills a room. He did not look down. Looking down was not useful. Up was the only direction that mattered right now. He pulled himself over the lip of the third ledge on his stomach, scraping his forearms on the stone, and lay there for 2 seconds catching his breath. The cavern entrance was 5 meters ahead of him, wide and dark, already thick with smoke pouring out from inside. The cries from within were louder now, more urgent, bouncing off the stone walls and spilling out into the hot afternoon air. Owen got to his feet. He checked the cloth across his face, pressed it tighter against his nose. He took 3 slow breaths. He thought of nothing in particular. He was not brave in any way he could have explained to anyone. He was simply a man standing in front of a dark entrance with smoke pouring out of it and small frightened things crying inside. He walked forward and stepped into the dark. The heat inside was immediate and heavy, pressing against him from all sides like a thick blanket. The smoke was gray and low, hanging from the ceiling and dropping toward the floor, and he dropped into a crouch automatically, getting under the worst of it. His eyes adjusted slowly. The cavern was bigger than he expected. Wide and deep, the walls orange and flickering from the glow of fire somewhere further in. And there, in the middle of the cavern floor, clustered together in a tight frightened group, were the hatchlings. 7 of them. No larger than large dogs, scaled in shades of dark green and gray, wings folded tight against their small bodies. They were pressed together in the center of the cave floor, away from the walls, turning in tight anxious circles. Some were hissing at the smoke. Some were making that thin high cry he had heard from below. One was completely still, frozen in place, too scared to move at all. None of them had seen him yet. Owen crouched lower. He kept perfectly still. And in a low, even, unhurried voice, the kind of voice that had no fear in it because there was no room left for fear, he began to speak. He said nothing important. He talked about the weather. He talked about the patrol route he had walked that morning. He talked about the coffee at the colony canteen that was always too bitter and never hot enough. He just kept his voice steady and low and present, a calm sound in the middle of all the noise and heat and smoke. One hatchling stopped hissing. Then another. The frozen one turned its small head slowly toward him. Owen reached out one open hand, palm up, and waited. The nearest hatchling took one small step toward him. Then another. It stretched its neck out and sniffed his fingers with great seriousness. Owen did not move. He kept talking, kept his voice level, kept his hand exactly where it was. Then the hatchling pressed its nose against his palm. Owen exhaled slowly. He reached forward, carefully, gently, and tucked the small creature against his chest with one arm. Then he turned back toward the smoke and the light, and began the first of what would turn out to be a very long series of trips. The first hatchling was the hardest to carry. It was small but it was not calm, even after it had pressed its nose against Owen's palm and allowed itself to be lifted. The moment he stood and turned toward the cave entrance it started to squirm. Its small claws dug into his forearm through his rolled sleeve, not out of anger but out of pure fear. Could smell the smoke outside. Could feel the heat. Every instinct it had was telling it to go back, to go deeper, to press itself against the stone floor and stay very still. Owen held it tighter. Not rough. Just firm. The way you hold something that is scared and does not yet understand that you are trying to help it. He moved in a low crouch, staying under the worst of the smoke, one arm wrapped around the hatchling and one hand touching the cave wall to keep his direction. The gray smoke was thicker near the entrance than it had been 2 minutes ago. He could feel the heat rising through the soles of his boots from the stone floor. Somewhere below the cliff the fire was still growing, still eating through brush and dry wood, pushing heat upward along the rock face like a slow, patient hand. He came out into the open air on the third ledge and immediately moved to the far edge, away from the smoke pouring from the cave mouth. He set the hatchling down on the stone and looked it over quickly. Eyes open. Breathing fast but steady. No burns. It looked back at him with wide amber eyes and made a low, uncertain sound. Owen had no time to be relieved. He turned and walked back into the cave. The second hatchling came easier. It had watched him take the first one out and come back, and something in that seemed to matter to it. Animals understood returning. They understood that something which left and came back was probably safe. It allowed Owen to pick it up with only a small protest and he carried it out the same way, low and steady, one hand on the wall. 2 down. 5 to go. He did not let himself think about the smoke getting worse. He did not let himself think about the fire below or the time ticking past or the fact that his backup was still 30 minutes away at best. He thought about the next hatchling. Only the next one. Everything else was noise. On the third trip he noticed something below the cliff. He had set the second hatchling down beside the first and stood for a half-second at the ledge edge to clear his lungs before going back in. That was when he saw her. Lyra was on the ledge directly below him, the second ledge maybe 15 meters down. She must have crawled there on 3 legs, her broken wing dragging against the rock, pulling herself up as far as she could get. She was pressed against the cliff face with her neck stretched upward and her golden eyes fixed on the cavern entrance above her. On him. Owen had never been looked at like that before. It was not the cold distant watching he was used to from the Veilthorn on the cliffs. It was something rawer than that. Something that had no distance in it at all. She was watching every move he made the way a person watches something they cannot control and cannot stop and can only witness, with the kind of attention that hurts. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he went back in. The third hatchling was the one that had been completely frozen when he first arrived, still in the same spot, still rigid, wings locked tight against its body. Owen crouched in front of it and waited. He spoke to it in the same low, even tone. He did not reach for it. He let it decide. The smoke was thicker now and every second he spent waiting was a second he did not have, but he had learned something on the first trip. You cannot rush a frightened creature into trusting you. You can only make yourself worth trusting and give it time to notice. It took 40 seconds. Then the frozen hatchling walked forward on stiff legs and pushed its head against his chest. Owen picked it up and moved. 4th trip. 5th trip coming. The smoke inside the cavern was dropping lower now. What had been knee height was approaching waist height and the air near the ceiling was almost completely gray. Owen stayed as low as he could, moving in a fast crouch that burned through his legs but kept him breathing. His eyes were streaming constantly. The wet cloth across his face was long dry and doing less and less with every trip, but he kept it in place because it was still doing something. On the ledge the 4 rescued hatchlings had clustered together. They watched the cave entrance every time Owen disappeared into it. They did not wander. They did not try to climb down the cliff. They waited for him to come back the same way he had come back every time before. Below, Lyra had not moved. She was still pressed against the rock on the second ledge, still watching, her broken wing folded tight and her jaw clenched. A thin line of something dark and wet was running down the scales below her left eye. Owen noticed it on his 4th exit. He did not have a word for what it meant. He knew what it looked like. He went back in for the 5th. He was halfway across the cavern floor when it happened. There was a sound like a deep crack, the kind of sound that a mountain makes when something inside it shifts, and then a section of the ceiling shelf directly above the entrance gave way. It did not fall all at once. It groaned first, a low terrible sound, and then the edge broke and a slab of burning rock came down fast and hard. Owen did not see it. He felt it. It caught him across the upper back and left shoulder like a hammer made of heat. The impact drove him down onto one knee and the breath went completely out of him. The hatchling in his arms, the 5th one, small and pale-scaled, made a sharp cry of fear. Owen curled forward over it on instinct, pulling it tight to his chest, putting his back between it and anything else that might fall. He stayed in that position, crouched over the hatchling, while the rest of the debris settled around him in a cloud of ash and dust. Silence for 2 seconds. Then Owen straightened up slowly. His left shoulder screamed at him. Something along his upper back felt wrong in a way he decided not to examine right now. He checked the hatchling first, eyes open, unharmed, already trying to squirm free. Good. He stood fully upright. His legs were steady. That was enough. He carried the 5th hatchling to the ledge and set it down beside the others. He rolled his left shoulder once carefully to check what it would and would not do. It would move. It hurt badly, but it would move. He pressed his hand against his back where the rock had caught him, felt the heat of a burn through his shirt, felt the deep ache that meant bruising and possibly worse. He pulled his hand away. 2 hatchlings left. He looked at the cave entrance. The collapse had narrowed it. The fallen shelf had taken a chunk out of the top and left side, and smoke was pouring out of the gap in a thick, steady stream. Going back in would mean crawling through a smaller opening into air that was almost certainly worse than what he had left 30 seconds ago. He looked down at Lyra. She had seen the rock fall. She had seen Owen go down on one knee. She had seen him curl over the hatchling to protect it. Now she was watching him stand at the cave entrance again, and she made a sound, low and long and cracked in the middle, that needed no translation in any language. It meant stop. It meant please. It meant you have done enough, you strange fragile creature, you have done more than enough. Please stop now. Owen looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the entrance. Somewhere past the smoke and the heat and the narrowed opening, 2 small things were alone in the dark, frightened and waiting, with no idea whether anyone was coming back for them. He got down on his hands and knees. He crawled through the narrowed entrance and disappeared into the smoke for the 6th time. Lyra pressed herself hard against the cliff rock and did not look away. She was still watching when the entrance collapsed completely, a slow and final sound, rock grinding on rock, sealing itself shut with Owen still inside. The 5 rescued hatchlings turned toward the sealed cave as one. They made no sound. They simply sat in a tight group on the ledge and faced the rock wall, the way creatures do when they are waiting for something they refuse to stop believing in. Below them, Lyra lowered her head against the stone and closed her eyes. Above them there was only smoke and silence. The migration flight took 3 days. It always had. Every year the adult Veilthorn flew east at the turning of the season, out past the gray hills, beyond the river valleys, all the way to the stone plateau where their ancestors were remembered. It was not a choice. It was not something that could be shortened or skipped. The dead required it. The clan law demanded it. And so they went every year without exception. Sareth had made this flight 147 times. He was leading the return when he smelled the smoke. It hit him from 30 miles out, faint at first, carried on the high wind, just a trace of something burnt and wrong threading through the clean mountain air. He said nothing. He tilted his great silver head and breathed it in slowly, reading it the way only very old creatures can read the air. Wood smoke. Fuel smoke. Hot rock. And underneath all of it, something else, something that made the old elder's chest tighten in a way it had not tightened in a very long time. He flew faster. The clan followed without being told. They could smell it too now. The younger ones made anxious sounds. The older ones went silent, which was worse. Silence among Veilthorn meant they already knew something was wrong and were preparing themselves for what they would find. Sareth cleared the last ridge and saw the cliffs. The fire below had burned itself down to smoldering black lines through the brush. The human fire response team had arrived and done their work, foam-soaked ground stretching in a wide pale arc along the cliff base. The smoke was thin now, the worst of it over. The colony vehicles were still there, small and white in the valley below, their lights blinking slow and steady. But it was not the fire that Sareth looked at first. It was the third ledge. The cavern entrance. The pile of collapsed rock sealing it shut. And the 5 hatchlings sitting in a silent row on the ledge, facing the sealed wall. Sareth landed hard on the second ledge and found Lyra there, pressed against the cliff face, her broken wing dragging, her head low. She looked up at him when he landed and something in her face stopped him completely. He had known Lyra since she hatched. He had never seen that expression on her before. He asked her what happened. One word, low and direct, in their oldest tongue. And Lyra told him. She told him everything. She took her time and she missed nothing. The smoke rising, the crash, her wing, the fire climbing the cliff path. She told him about the human soldier who had come up the cliff alone. She told him about the first trip and the second and the third. She told him about the frozen hatchling and how the human had crouched in the smoke and waited in that heat, until the hatchling was ready to trust him. She told him about the 4th trip and the 5th and the rock shelf that came down across the human's back and how he had curled over the hatchling and covered it with his own body. She told him about the 6th trip. The entrance collapsing. The silence after. Sareth listened to all of it without moving. His amber eyes were fixed on Lyra's face and he did not look away once. When she finished he stood still for a long moment, the wind moving slow across his silver scales, the smoldering valley spread out below him. Then he turned to the sealed cavern entrance and studied it. The collapse was significant. A full section of the upper shelf had come down, driven by the heat weakening the old rock. It was not a small pile of loose stone. It was deep and heavy and unstable. Moving it wrong would bring more down. He called the clan together. They worked in shifts, 4 at a time, careful and methodical, lifting stone and passing it back along a chain. Sareth directed every movement. He had seen cave collapses before. He knew how they behaved, how the weight distributed, where the pockets formed. He knew which stones could be moved and which ones were holding everything else in place and had to be left until the right moment. The human fire team stood at the base of the cliff and watched. Their team leader, a broad woman named Greta Sands, had climbed to the second ledge and was watching the dig with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She had been told a soldier was inside. She had looked at the collapsed entrance and done the same quiet calculation everyone else had done and reached the same quiet conclusion. She watched anyway. You watched anyway. That was the rule she had made for herself a long time ago. One of her team members came up beside her after the first hour and said nothing. He just stood there with her. That was enough. The hatchlings did not move from the third ledge. All 5 of them sat in the same row, facing the rock wall, occasional low sounds passing between them. Once, the smallest one walked forward and pressed its nose against the sealed stone. Then it walked back and sat down again. Lyra watched the dig from below, her neck craned upward, her broken wing held carefully against her side. She had stopped making sounds. She was simply watching, with the focused and fragile attention of someone who has run out of things to do except believe. 2 hours passed. Sareth had moved to the center of the dig now, working alongside the younger clan members, his great clawed hands moving stone with a precision that came from centuries of careful work. He had said almost nothing since Lyra finished her account. The clan did not need words from him right now. They needed his hands and his knowledge and his certainty that the work was worth doing. It was on the 119th stone. He would know this later without knowing why he had counted, that the air changed. A small breath came through the gap. Cool and slow and thin but unmistakably moving, air coming from inside from a space that still existed from somewhere in the dark behind the rock. Sareth raised one hand. The clan stopped. He lowered his head to the gap and breathed in. Smoke. Burnt fabric. Stone dust. Blood faint but present. And underneath all of it, breathing. 2 small rhythms, fast and shallow. And one larger rhythm, slower, rougher but continuous. Alive. He said nothing. He pointed at 3 specific stones. The clan moved them. He pointed at 2 more. Those moved. He worked the next section himself, his hands steady and exact, opening the gap stone by stone until there was enough light to see inside. What he saw in that small hollow stayed with him for the rest of his long life. Owen Hart was on his side in a narrow air pocket at the back of the cave, knees pulled up, both arms wrapped around the last 2 hatchlings held against his chest. His burned jacket was off his body and pressed over their faces. Just the faces, positioned carefully to filter the worst of the smoke from their breathing while leaving their bodies free. His own face was turned into the crook of his arm, using the sleeve the same way. He was unconscious. Burns across his back showed dark through his torn shirt. His left shoulder sat at a wrong angle. His hands were raw and cracked from the heat of the stone. There was blood dried along his hairline from somewhere under his hair. But his arms were still wrapped around the hatchlings. Even unconscious, some part of him had not let go. The 2 hatchlings inside were awake. Their eyes caught the new light immediately and both of them turned toward the opening, toward the fresh air, toward the large shapes of their kin on the other side of the rock. They made soft urgent sounds. But they did not move away from Owen. They stayed pressed against his chest, one on each side, their small bodies tucked under his arms. When a young clan member reached carefully into the opening to lift them out, the nearest hatchling turned and made a sharp sound, not fear, not aggression. A warning. A clear and unmistakable signal that said not yet. Sareth watched this from above the opening, completely still. The rescuers carefully lifted Owen first, slow and gentle, for sets of hands supporting him fully, bringing him out into the open air with the kind of care usually reserved for the oldest and most honored of the clan. The moment Owen was clear of the rock, both hatchlings followed immediately, crawling out through the opening and pressing themselves against his sides before he had even been set down on the ledge. The 5 waiting hatchlings came forward at once, a quiet rush of small-scaled bodies, and within seconds all 7 were arranged around Owen in a close and deliberate circle, some pressing their faces against his hands, some simply sitting and watching his chest rise and fall. Greta Sands stood at the edge of the ledge and pressed her hand over her mouth. Sareth stood above the circle of hatchlings and the unconscious man at the center and was quiet for a very long time. The wind moved across the cliff face. Below, the valley was still and the last of the smoke was thinning into clean air. He was 400 years old. He had seen things that most creatures never saw and lived through things that most creatures never survived. He had believed, for most of those 400 years, that he understood what different species were and were not capable of. He looked at Owen Hart's burned hands, still curled in the shape of holding something even now, and understood that he had been wrong about at least one thing. He opened his mouth and spoke one word. It was old, older than the colony, older than the human language, older than the common trade tongue they all used to understand each other. Most of the younger Veilthorn in the clan had only ever heard it in the telling of old stories, spoken about figures from centuries past. It was not used lightly. It had never, in Saretha's own lifetime, been spoken for anyone who was not Veilthorn by blood. The word meant kinbound by fire. The clan went completely silent. Lyra, still on the ledge below, heard it through the still air. She closed her eyes. Something that had been wound very tight inside her chest since the cave entrance collapsed finally, slowly, came undone. Owen woke up in a place he did not recognize. The ceiling above him was stone, dark gray, smooth in some places and rough in others, carved with long flowing lines that moved across the surface like slow rivers frozen in rock. The air was cool and dry and carried a faint smell of something herbal, something burnt at the edges, something old. There was light coming from somewhere to his left, but he could not find a source for it. It simply existed in the air, soft and amber, like late afternoon sun filtered through deep water. He tried to sit up. Everything from his waist to his neck informed him, clearly and immediately, that sitting up was not something that was going to happen today. He lay back down, stared at the ceiling, took stock of himself the way soldiers learn to do, starting at the feet and working upward, checking what moved and what hurt and what did neither. His feet were fine. His legs were fine. His ribs ached on the left side with every breath, but nothing felt broken. His left shoulder was bound tightly against his body with something soft and firm, immovable, and when he tested it even slightly, the pain that came back was sharp enough to make him stop testing immediately. His back felt like someone had pressed a hot iron against it and left it there for an hour. His hands were wrapped in something cool and damp that smelled like the herbal scent in the air. He turned his head slowly to the right. 3 hatchlings were asleep against the wall 2 feet from his stone bed, pressed together in a small pile, their breathing slow and even. The smallest one, the pale-scaled one he had carried on the 5th trip, the one he had curled over when the rock shelf came down, was closest to him, its nose almost touching the edge of his bed. Owen looked at it for a while. Then he looked back at the ceiling. He was alive. The hatchlings were alive. Everything else could wait. He slept again without meaning to. When he woke the second time, Sareth was there. The old elder was sitting across the chamber. If sitting was the right word for the way a 400-year-old dragon settled itself onto stone, which was more like a mountain deciding to rest. He was simply present, large and still and silver-scaled, his amber eyes open and fixed on Owen with an expression that gave nothing away. Owen looked at him. Sareth looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside the chamber, somewhere beyond the carved stone walls, Owen could hear the distant sounds of the clan moving and calling to each other, the low resonant sounds of Veilthorn voices carrying through the rock. Finally Owen said in a voice that came out rougher than he expected, "How long?" Sareth said, "1 day and 1 night." Owen absorbed this. He thought about the colony. About his radio sitting on a flat rock at the base of the cliff. About his commanding officer, who was probably somewhere between furious and relieved right now, possibly both at the same time. "The hatchlings," Owen said. "All 7 are well," Sareth said. "You will see them all shortly. The other 4 have been difficult to keep away from this room." Owen almost smiled. It pulled at something on his face that he decided not to pull it further. Sareth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to explain something to you. I ask that you listen to all of it before you speak." Owen looked at him. "All right." Sareth began. He spoke in the common trade language, carefully, choosing each word with the deliberate precision of someone who knows that what they are saying matters and cannot afford to be misunderstood. He explained that in Veilthorn culture, the bond between a hatchling and the one who protects it in its first season is not symbolic. It is not honorary. It is written into the oldest layer of their clan law, older than the memory wall, older than the migration, older than almost everything the clan still practiced. The law existed because in the earliest days of the Veilthorn, when the world was less settled and danger came from every direction, the survival of hatchlings was the survival of the clan itself. Anyone who gave themselves, truly gave themselves at true cost, to protect hatchlings in mortal danger became bound to those hatchlings. Not as a servant. Not as a keeper. As kin. The word for it was old. Sareth did not translate it. He simply said the Veilthorn word slowly, the way you say a word when you want someone to understand that the word itself carries weight that translation cannot hold. Owen listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he had promised. When Sareth finished, Owen was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 3 sleeping hatchlings against the wall. He looked at his wrapped hands resting on the stone bed in front of him. He looked back at Sareth. Then he said, "I didn't go in there for a bond." Sareth said nothing. Owen said, "I didn't go in there for a title or a law or anything like that. I went in because they were scared. They were alone and they were scared and the fire was coming and there was nobody else." He paused. His voice was still rough but it was steady. "I would have done the same thing for anyone." Sareth looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then Owen said something quieter. Almost to himself, almost to the ceiling, in the way people say things they have carried for a long time without realizing how heavy they were. He said, "Nobody should have to die scared and alone. Not if there is someone who can do something about it." That is all it was. The chamber was very quiet. Sareth sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "You say you would have done the same for anyone." "Yes," Owen said. "And yet," Sareth said slowly, "most did not." Owen had no answer for that. He looked at the ceiling. Sareth stood, that slow mountain-rising movement, and looked down at Owen from his full height. "The bond is not a reward," he said. "It is not given because you deserve something. It is recognized because something true already exists. What you did created it. Our law simply names what is already there." He moved toward the chamber entrance. Stopped. Did not turn around. "Rest," he said. "You will need your strength. The clan will want to see you when you are able to stand." Then he left. Owen stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. The 3 hatchlings slept on undisturbed. The smallest one shifted in its sleep and pressed closer to his bed without waking. He looked at it, the pale scales, the small folded wings, the tiny rise and fall of its breathing, and felt something he could not name settle somewhere in the middle of his chest. He closed his eyes. That night Lyra could not sleep. She walked the outer edge of the ancestral grounds on 3 legs, her broken wing bound tight against her body with the same herb-soaked wrap the healers had used on Owen's shoulder. The healers said 3 weeks before the wing would bear weight again. She had listened and nodded and spent most of the day ignoring the ache of it because the ache of it was nothing compared to what the day before had felt like. She was passing the memory wall when she saw him. Sareth was standing alone in front of the great carved stone face, 30 meters of names and scenes and history cut deep into the rock over 4 centuries of clan life. He was standing near the lower right edge where the stone was still smooth and uncut, pale and untouched, waiting. He had a carving tool in his right hand. Lyra stopped. She stood in the shadow of the outer arch and watched. Sareth raised the tool to the stone. He worked slowly, not because his hands were uncertain but because the work mattered and work that matters does not get rushed. The sound of it was small and steady in the quiet night air, a soft rhythmic tapping that carried no further than the grounds. He leaned close to the stone as he worked, checking each line, correcting nothing because there was nothing to correct. Lyra watched him for a long time. She had known Sareth her whole life. She had seen him angry and she had seen him patient and she had seen him grieve and she had seen him lead. She had never seen him at the memory wall at night, alone, working by the light of the amber glow that lived in the stone of the ancestral grounds. The memory wall was not a casual thing. Every name on it had been placed there by Sareth himself personally, because he had decided that the law required it, that what that person had done had changed the fate of the clan in a way that needed to be remembered for as long as the rock stood. There were not many names. Lyra had counted them as a young dragon the way young dragons count the things that matter, slowly and with great seriousness. There were 3 names. 3 in 400 years. She watched Sareth work through the night and did not interrupt him. She did not need to see what he was carving to know what it said. Arthur Penn had done this job for 15 years. He had sat across tables from species that communicated through color changes in their skin. He had negotiated water rights with a civilization that measured time in geological ages. He had once spent 11 hours in a sealed chamber with a delegation that breathed methane, wearing a full respirator, because the talks were too important to reschedule. He was not easily made nervous. He was nervous this morning. He stood at the boundary line of the Valethorn ancestral grounds, a low ridge of pale stones arranged in a long arc across the cliff path, old enough that the stones had sunk halfway into the earth, and waited. His assistant Nora Webb stood 2 steps behind him with a data pad and the careful expression of someone who has learned to show nothing on their face in professional situations. 2 colony security officers stood further back at the vehicle. Arthur had told them to stay there and they had, which was the right call. Showing up to this with armed escorts would have been the kind of mistake you did not get to make twice. He had his prepared words ready. He had gone over them that morning in his office. Calm, respectful, acknowledging the situation, firm on the core point. Sergeant Owen Hart was colony military personnel. His commanding officer needed confirmation of his condition. The colony had a responsibility to its people. The Valethorn were valued neighbors and this matter could be resolved simply and with goodwill on both sides. Good words. Reasonable words. He had used similar words in harder situations and they had worked. He heard the sound of heavy movement on the path above and looked up. Sareth came down alone. The old elder moved without hurry, his silver scales catching the flat morning light, his amber eyes fixed on Arthur from the moment he came into view. He was enormous up close. Arthur had seen Valethorn from a distance plenty of times but there was something different about standing at the boundary stones while one of them walked directly toward you. Something that reminded every ancient and unhelpful part of the human brain exactly how large a 400-year-old dragon actually was. Arthur held his ground. He straightened slightly. He nodded in the respectful way he had practiced. Sareth stopped at the boundary stones and looked down at him. Arthur began his prepared words. He spoke clearly and at a measured pace, hitting every point he had planned. The colony's concern for their soldier, the need for confirmation of condition and status, the value of the relationship between the settlement and the Veilthorn clan, the hope that this could be handled with mutual respect and cooperation. He kept his voice level. He kept his hands still. He finished and waited. Sareth listened to all of it with his eyes half closed and his head tilted very slightly to one side, the way very old things listen to things they are in no hurry to respond to. When Arthur finished, Sareth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me." He turned and walked back up the path. Arthur glanced back at Nora. She raised her eyebrows very slightly, which was her version of "I have no idea but you should probably go." He turned and followed the elder up the path and into the ancestral grounds. He had never been in here before. Nobody from the colony had. He tried not to look like he was looking at everything and failed because everything was worth looking at. The grounds were carved from the living rock of the cliff interior, wide chambers and long corridors, surfaces covered in the flowing line work he had only seen in photographs taken from far outside. The amber light lived in the stone itself somehow, warm and steady, sourceless. The air was cooler than outside and tasted faintly of the herbal preparations the Veilthorn healers used. He heard hatchlings somewhere, the thin bright sounds of young dragons moving and calling to each other, and underneath that, lower and further away, the steady sounds of the clan going about its mourning. Sareth led him through 2 corridors and 1 wide chamber and then stopped. Arthur almost walked into him. He stepped to the side and looked at what Sareth had stopped in front of. The memory wall. He had read about it in every briefing document ever written about the Veilthorn. He had seen the one photograph that existed, taken 30 years ago from a considerable distance by the colony's first contact team. The photograph had not prepared him for this either. It was 30 meters wide and 4 meters tall, every centimeter of it covered in carvings so dense and detailed that his eyes did not know where to start. Faces and figures and scenes and text in the old Veilthorn script, layered over centuries, each carving made with absolute precision, nothing wasted, nothing careless. Dragon figures in flight and in battle and in ceremony. Names in script so old that even the Veilthorn translators the colony employed sometimes struggled with the oldest sections. The weight of it was not just visual. It was something you felt standing in front of it, the accumulated reality of 400 years of things that mattered enough to be made permanent. Arthur stood in front of it and let his eyes move slowly across the surface. Sareth watched him without speaking. It was Nora, who had followed them in quietly and was standing at Arthur's left shoulder, who found it first. She said nothing. She simply touched Arthur's arm and pointed. Lower right corner. The stone still pale at the cut edges, the carving fresh enough that fine dust still clung to the lower lines. Not yet darkened by time the way everything around it was. Standing out against the ancient surface like a new page bound into a very old book. A human figure. Clearly, unmistakably human, upright, 2-legged, the proportions correct in a way that meant whoever carved it had looked carefully at what they were rendering. The figure was walking forward through carved flames that rose on both sides. Its arms were held across its chest and in them, pressed close to its body, were 2 small dragon shapes. Hatchlings. Their wings folded, their heads tucked. Safe. Above the figure, carved in clean lines, first in Veilthorn script and directly below it in the common alphabet that both species shared. Owen Hart. Arthur read it twice. He stood in front of it without speaking for a long time. He was aware of Nora beside him and Sareth behind him and the sounds of the clan in the corridors beyond, and he was aware of none of them fully because his entire attention was on 2 words carved in fresh pale stone on the oldest wall in the Veilthorn world. Sareth spoke. "When I was young," he said, "our clan lost 17 hatchlings in a single season. Illness. We had no remedy and no knowledge to find one. A healer from the Eastern Range flew for 4 days without rest to reach us and spent 3 weeks working until she found what worked. She saved 9 of the remaining 11. She asked for nothing and returned home when it was done." He paused. "I carved her name into that wall. That was 170 years ago. It was the first name I ever carved." Arthur turned to look at him. "The second," Sareth continued, "was a young clan member who stood alone at the northern pass for 2 days holding back a rock slide with his own body so that the hatchlings being moved through the pass could reach safety. He did not survive." The elder's voice did not change. It was simply factual, the way the recounting of important things often is when enough time has passed. The third was a female elder who gave the last of her strength to shield the clan memory records during a fire 7 decades ago. She lived. She never fully recovered. He stopped. 3 names, he said. In 400 years. Arthur looked back at the wall. at the fresh pale carving in the lower corner. "Last night," Sareth said, "I carved a fourth." The chamber was quiet. Arthur turned fully to face the elder. He kept his voice professional because that was what the moment required of him. "I need to ask, is Sergeant Hart being held here? The colony has a responsibility to confirm his status and his freedom of movement." Sareth looked at him with those cold amber eyes. Not unkind. Not warm. Simply direct, the way very old things are direct when they have long since stopped seeing the point of anything else. "Your soldier," Sareth said, "has been free to leave since the moment he arrived. No door in these grounds has ever been closed to him. No word has been spoken to keep him. He stays because he chooses to stay." Pause. "He is sitting with the hatchlings this morning. You may go and ask him yourself if you would like." Arthur nodded slowly. "And if he chooses to return to the colony?" "Then he returns," Sareth said simply. "We do not cage those who run into fire." He let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he added, quietly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "We remember them." Arthur looked one more time at the fresh carving on the ancient wall. At the human figure walking through flames with two small dragons held safe against its chest. At the name above it, pale and new against 4 centuries of dark stone. He thought about 15 years of careful diplomacy and trade language and prepared words and negotiated boundaries. He thought about a man who set his radio down on a rock and climbed. He turned to Nora. She already had the datapad open. Her eyes were bright in a way she was not trying to hide anymore. "Note for the record," Arthur said quietly. "Sergeant Hart is confirmed present, confirmed free, confirmed in good standing with the Veilthorn clan." He paused. "Also note, request a photographer. The colony archive needs a proper record of this wall." He looked back at the carving one last time. "All of it," he said. "Not just the new part." The first visitor arrived 9 days after the fire. She came from the Eastern Range, an old clan elder named Marin, gray-scaled and slow-moving, who had flown 300 miles on wings that were not as strong as they once were. She landed at the boundary stones without announcement and simply stood there until Sareth came out to meet her. She said she had heard the story. She said she wanted to see the wall. Sareth led her inside without a word. She stood in front of the memory wall for a long time. She read the carving. She looked at the human figure walking through flames with 2 small dragons against its chest. She read the name above it, first in Veilthorn script, then in the common alphabet below. Then she turned and asked Sareth to take her to the human. Owen was in the outer courtyard when they found him, sitting on a flat stone in the morning sun with 4 of the hatchlings arranged around him in various states of wakefulness. He was attempting to eat breakfast. Pip was attempting to eat his breakfast for him. This had been the pattern for several mornings now, and neither of them had resolved it satisfactorily. Marin looked at this for a moment. Then she looked at Sareth. Sareth said nothing. He had the expression of someone who had also witnessed the breakfast situation multiple mornings and had decided it was beneath his dignity to comment on. Marin turned back to Owen and studied him the way very old creatures study things they have traveled a long way to understand. Slowly, completely, without any pretense of casualness. Owen looked back at her with the calm, steady patience that seemed to be his natural state. Pip, undeterred by the presence of a visiting elder, successfully stole a piece of Owen's food and retreated 2 steps with it. Marin made a sound. It took Owen a moment to realize it was laughter. She stayed for 2 days. When she left, she told Sareth that she would be sending word to the southern clans. Sareth said that was her choice. She said it was not a choice, it was a responsibility. Then she spread her old wings and flew back east. After that they came steadily. Not in large groups. The Veilthorn did not travel in crowds the way some species did. They came in 1s and 2s and 3s, elders mostly, flying from ranges that spread across the continent and in 2 cases from islands that required crossing open water. They all came the same way, quietly without announcement, landing at the boundary stones and waiting. They all asked for the same 2 things. The wall and the human. Owen met all of them. He did not find this easy. He was not by nature a person who enjoyed being looked at or talked about, but he understood that it mattered, and so he showed up every time, sat still, answered questions in his quiet way, and did not make anyone feel unwelcome for coming. Lyra sat nearby during most of these meetings. She did not say much. Her presence was enough. She was the witness, the one who had been there, and the visitors understood that. Some of the visiting elders brought gifts. Not large things. Small carved stones, pieces of mineral from their home ranges, small tokens that carried meaning in their clan traditions. Owen accepted each one with the same careful respect and kept them in a clay bowl on the stone shelf near his sleeping area. The hatchlings investigated every new item thoroughly and Pip attempted to eat 2 of them, which Owen prevented both times. The hatchlings had names now. Owen had given them quietly, one by one, over the first week. Not formally, not as any kind of ceremony, just the way you name things you see every day because nameless things are harder to talk to. Ash was the first one he had carried out, the dark-scaled one who had pressed its nose to his palm. Ember was the one who had been frozen in place and taken 40 seconds to trust him. Stone was the heaviest, solidly built, who moved slowly and deliberately and reminded Owen of certain sergeants he had known. Flint had a temper and got into disagreements with the clan's adult members twice a week. Dusk was quiet and watchful and often found sitting in high places looking at the horizon. Rain made sounds constantly, a running commentary on everything happening around it that nobody could fully interpret but everyone had to listen to. And Pip was small and pale and completely convinced that Owen's primary purpose in the world was to be Pip's personal food source and furniture. Lyra pretended to find the names undignified. She used them when she thought no one was listening. Sareth definitely heard her. He said nothing. 4 weeks after the fire, Arthur Penn sent a message requesting a formal meeting with Sareth. He arrived the next morning with Nora and a colony legal representative named George Alcott who carried a very organized folder and the expression of a man preparing to do something that had never been done before and was not entirely sure what form it should take. The meeting was about Owen. Not about releasing him. That question had been settled on the day Arthur first visited. It was about something more permanent. Owen had submitted a formal request to the colony command the previous week, a request that had apparently surprised his commanding officer considerably, asking to be reassigned. Not away from the colony. Not away from the Veilthorn. He was asking for a new post. A joint post. Something that did not currently exist and would have to be created from nothing. A permanent human liaison, recognized by both the colony and the Veilthorn clan, living and working between both worlds. The colony command had said it needed Veilthorn agreement before it could move forward. Sareth had said it needed colony formalization before he would make it clan law. Both sides had then looked at Arthur Penn in the way that people look at diplomats when they want something done and do not want to do it themselves. Arthur sat in the outer chamber across from Sareth for 2 hours. George Alcott's organized folder got significantly less organized as the meeting went on. Nora filled 4 pages of notes. At the end of it, both sides had agreed on terms that George said he would need a week to write up properly and Sareth said he would need 3 days to present to the clan elders. Owen, when told the outline of the agreement afterward, sat quietly for a moment and then said, "That seems all right." Lyra, who was sitting nearby, made a sound that in Veilthorn meant something between finally and obviously. The Galactic Settlement Council met 6 weeks later in the orbital station above the planet, a large formal body where colony expansion requests were reviewed by all recognized species with territorial interest in a region. The Ashford Ridge colony had a pending expansion permit that had been blocked by Veilthorn objection for 60 years. Every human diplomat who had ever worked the region had accepted it as a permanent wall. It was simply one of those facts you worked around. Sareth attended the council session in person. This was unusual. The Veilthorn typically sent junior representatives to these proceedings. The room noticed. The council chair, a tall gray-skinned administrator named Petra Voss who had run these sessions for 11 years, opened the Ashford Ridge file as a routine matter, fully expecting the standard objection to be restated. She looked at her notes. She looked at the Veilthorn representative present. She recognized Sareth from the briefing photographs and kept her expression professional with some effort. Sareth spoke first. He stated clearly that the Veilthorn were withdrawing their objection to the Ashford Ridge expansion permit. The permit could proceed. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something happens that nobody prepared for. Petra Voss looked at her notes again. 60 years was a long time for a block to stand. In her experience, things that stood for 60 years did not move without significant reason. She asked carefully what had changed. Sareth was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the quiet of someone choosing words that are worth the weight of what needs to be said. Then he said, "We spent 60 years watching humans from a distance and deciding what they were. One of them showed us we were wrong to do that. We have decided to stop watching from a distance." Nobody asked a follow-up question. The permit passed. That evening Owen sat on the 3rd ledge of Drakenmore Cliffs. The same ledge where it had all started, where he had pulled himself over the lip of the rock on his stomach with smoke already filling the air and the cries of frightened hatchlings coming from the dark ahead of him. The stone under him was the same stone. The view across the valley was the same view. The twin moons were coming up slow and orange over the eastern hills the way they did every clear evening on this world. Ash was asleep against his left side. Pip was asleep against his right side with its nose pressed into the crook of his arm. The other 5 were somewhere in the grounds behind him. He could hear Rain's constant commentary drifting out through the rock somewhere above. His scarred hand rested on the stone of the ledge. The burns had healed into pale uneven lines across his knuckles and the back of his hand, permanent now, which the colony medic had told him was expected and Owen had said was fine. They did not hurt anymore. They were simply there, the way some things become simply part of you after a while, unremarkable and true. He looked out across the valley at the colony lights beginning to come on in the early dark. His colony. His post. His place still in a different shape than before. He heard movement behind him. He did not turn around. He did not need to. He had learned over the past weeks to recognize the particular sound of Sareth moving, the slow and deliberate weight of him, the way the stone responded differently under 4 centuries of living than it did under everything else. The old elder settled somewhere behind him and to the left. Not close. Not far. Present in the way that certain people are present. Not demanding anything, not filling the silence, simply there. The valley went darker. The colony lights brightened against it. The moons climbed. Pip shifted in its sleep and made a small sound and pressed its nose harder into Owen's arm. Owen looked down at it. Pale scales, small folded wings, completely relaxed in the way that things are relaxed when they feel entirely safe. He stayed still so as not to wake it. Behind him, somewhere in the warm amberlit interior of the ancestral grounds, the memory wall stood in the quiet. 4 names in the stone. 3 dark with time. 1 still pale at the cut edges, still new, still carrying the fine dust of fresh carving in its deepest lines. It would darken with time. Everything did. In 10 years it would look like it had always been there. In 50 it would be indistinguishable from the names around it. In 100 it would be simply part of the wall, part of the record, part of what the clan carried forward into whatever came next. But it was there now. Permanent and exact and true. Owen Hart. Carved deep enough to outlast the man it named. Carved deep enough to outlast the mountain, if the mountain was patient enough and the stone held. Sareth sat behind him in the dark and said nothing and needed to say nothing, and the valley spread wide and quiet below them both. The moons rose. The lights of the colony burned steady across the dark. Ash and Pip slept on, warm and unhurried, against the sides of the human who had run into the fire. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.